You're watching Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi. I'm glad to be joined from Miami by Cleo Paskal. She's a senior fellow at Foundation for Defence of Democracies and an associate fellow Chatham House. Ms. Paskal, thank you so much for your time. Some other time we could probably discuss maple syrup pancakes and the Stanley Cup, but a little bit more serious this time. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And also from Washington, D.C., Tanvi Madan, Director India Project and Senior Fellow with the Foreign Policy Brookings Institution. She's also the author of A Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped U.S.-India Relations During the Cold War. Dr. Madan, thank you for joining us. And I believe from your Twitter handle that if I call you Dr. Madan, you'll get more tweets on prescriptions.
Well, the real Dr. Madan in my family is my mother. So I'll send the patients that are asking me about their health towards her.
On a more serious note, Dr. Madan, the Quad meeting, the Foreign Ministerial, the second one that's happening next week in Japan. How significant do you see the signaling coming at the time that it does?
So I think it shows that the Quad has evolved from 2017, when the first meeting was held in November in Southeast Asia. Many people had said this is not going to last. And all sides, step by step, have steadily met at the working level. Last year, the Quad was upgraded to the ministerial level. And the fact, to me, the important fact is that normally the natural instinct would have been at another time in the midst of a China-India crisis that Delhi would have said, and this is not about this government or previous government, but tradition would have been that you say, we're not going to participate in such a high-profile meeting that might rile up the Chinese further. Well, I think it's a sign both of how India sees China these days, but also who it sees its partners as, that it has decided to go ahead with what will be a high-profile meeting that is taking place in person in the middle of COVID. And so I think it is an important signal, both about India-China relations, but also I think to show that the Quad is now evolved into something that seems to be sustainable, even though it might not meet everybody's litmus test or wish list for what it should be doing.
Ms. Paskal, the Quad in itself, like Dr. Madan is pointing out, it has a lot of commonalities. There are differences among the members itself. But this meeting and coming at this time, how do you see it in terms of the evolution of the Quad and how it had almost died and then was resurrected, so as to speak?
Yeah, so COVID's been very helpful for motivating and focusing minds. But at the same time, there have been a lot of structural elements put in place, including a lot of logistic agreements signed bilaterally between the different countries involved. So it makes it easier to become operational. And the Quad itself, they're complicated relationships between each of the countries, each of the four countries. But what we're seeing is those bilateral relationships growing. The India-Japan relationship is growing. The India-Australia relationship, which has been very complex and difficult, is starting to grow a little bit in relation to what's happening with China. So as those bilaterals grow, the structures underpinning the Quad become more stable.
Dr. Madan, I mean, here in India, you've seen what's happened post-Galwan, post-Ladakh, in terms of the mood among people and how the government has responded or not responded to that. There is a strand of thought which thinks that the militarization of the Quad, or the next step towards that, is what is needed. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think, as Dr. Paskal said, that it is, you're already seeing, while you might have not seen Australia and Malabar yet, and I say yet because I think it's only a matter of time, I think what you have already seen is these bilateral and trilateral, whether it's exercises, there's an entire infrastructure that's been built. So you have the bilateral, trilateral exercises. You also have occasionally, for example, last year, the US, India, Japan, Philippines group sail through the South China Sea. You have each of these countries now, for example, has logistics support agreements with each other. Each one has a 2+2 or India has a 2+2 with each of the countries now at ministerial level. So I think the interest, even if you don't, kind of do that next level, there's a higher level of interoperability. I think what I'd like to see in the future is for this to be kind of more, get to a next level of complexity. And I think continue to develop those habits of cooperation. That when a contingency arises, and it's likely to be that contingency, the first time they perhaps have to use it is something like a HADR contingency, like it was post-tsunami. So I think, you're already seeing much of that. If and when Australia is in Malabar, I think, that sends a signal. But I think, and it will help the four countries engage and operate. But I do think a lot has been done over the last few years, and I think it's right that, to me, the big change and the biggest shift has come in India-Australia relations. I, for one, am glad that they took the time to develop deeper bilateral ties, interoperability before Australia comes into the Quad, because then I think it would have been that both countries would have had better relations with the others and not very kind of deep relations with each other. So I think it's good to have had this evolutionary kind of step towards what might eventually become kind of a maritime Quad. But I do think, we've made that the holy grail, so to speak. But I think there are a number of other places these countries have been operating together, including in quadrilaterals, just not with each other.
Mr. Paskal, since Dr. Madan brought up Australia, now the view from New Delhi in the immediate past in terms of how Australia was dealing with China was probably one of the reasons why India was so hesitant to go full hog with the Quad, because the impression was that if governments change, but it's true that if governments change anywhere, policy is good. But how far do you think that Australia is now down the line to convincing India and the rest of not only the Quad, but any of the members that are looking at pushing back against China, that it is here to stay?
Well, it was legitimate to be concerned about Australia because they torpedoed the Quad the first time around, right? They changed their policy, and it was very overtly about not wanting to rile up China. So in a lot of countries, including in Australia and in the United States and in Japan as well, there is a division between the political and economic community, which is much softer on China. China's been very effective at buying up influence in those sectors, and the defense, intelligence, and security communities on the other side, who are much more concerned about domestic stability and international security. So that polarization that discussion internally has been going on for years. But what happened with COVID was the economic situation got so bad. The argument was always, don't rock the economic boat. We've got a good thing going with China, but the boat is sinking. So that political and economic voice diminished to a certain degree. And in the case of Australia, there was a lot of discussion with the Americans, let's put it that way, about how China was becoming embedded in their systems. So that voice decreased, and the defense, intelligence, and security voices increased. The question is, how long will that balance stay? Hopefully it's here for
good. When both of you pointed out, Dr. Madan, that it's not just the Quad in terms of four of these countries, whether it's in the military domain or other domains, operating together or reaching some kind of consensus on what to do. They've been doing it bilaterally or even trilaterally, or with other countries. You have the US, Philippines, and India, say. We just had JIMEX, the Japanese and the Indian naval exercises as well. And it's not just the maritime domain. You're looking at the supply chain resilience, you're looking at cyber and digital as well, and other areas, right?
Yes. And so, what I think that's what's important is, these days the term like-minded partners has caught on. And I think, on different issues, there might be different like-mindeds. And so you're seeing kind of these coalitions, not just the Quad, but others coming together, which are issue-based. I think the Quad, to me, the reason why on certain, whether it's maritime security, regional connectivity, cyber issues, HADR, and kind of, as I said, maritime security to start with, the reason I think these countries make sense is I think of them as a coalition of the willing and capable in the region. Having said that, and I'd recommend an article or an op-ed that former Foreign Secretary Indian Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale wrote, I think it was yesterday, where he pointed out the importance that it is important for the Quad to define itself for the region, because it's important to take for example, the Southeast Asians on board, the other East Asian countries, including South Korea, not necessarily have them expand the Quad, but explain that what the Quad's goals are is a vision of a region that is inclusive, that's free and open in the sense of kind of the free country states having the freedom to choose their policies and approaches. So I think it is important for these countries to do these things with each other, but also where possible bring together other countries. So I think for that reason, the kind of Deputy Secretary of State level meetings during COVID were good in the sense of bringing together the Quad plus plus Korea, South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam. And then Secretary of State Pompeo hosted a set of meetings with Brazil, Israel, and South Korea as well. So I think it's important that across the board, and now, I think supply chain resilience is going to be an area, but I think you're going to hear the word resilience much more. And it's not just economic resilience. It will be, and I think this was key to the Australian shift, political, societal resilience, which is the shift in Australia, which starts about 2016, 2017, really happens because of concerns about political and societal interference. And I think foreign interference more broadly, something India is very familiar with talking about. But I think this idea of resilience across the board is something that you're going to hear not just from the Quad countries, not just about the regions, but even from the Europeans in the months and years ahead.
Mr. Paskal, the point that Dr. Madan is bringing up about Southeast Asia, about ASEAN, and though we've seen some signs from Vietnam or Thailand within ASEAN, but the ASEAN, the peculiarity is that it needs to have consensus. How do you make sure the Prime Minister's speech in Singapore was aimed, I presume, at that, to show that the Quad was inclusive, it wasn't an exclusive club? How do you bring on board ASEAN?
So I think that it's helpful. It's very hard to know what direction it's going to go in, but one direction that could be very helpful is to say that the Quad is essentially operational. And you raised that interesting question about how you continue something like the Quad through changes in administration in each of the countries. And one thing is you put in physical infrastructures. So for example, you put a Quad headquarters in the Andamans or in the Senkakus. You make it very clear that's what the Quad is. But then you do something completely different about the political unification, and that or designing of a common goal. And that would be something like has been proposed out of India, like an Indo-Pacific Charter, which would be an updating of the 1941 Atlantic Charter, which basically said the Quad is how we fight, and an Indo-Pacific Charter would be why we fight. And it could include things like data sovereignty, space governance, all those sort of issues that had to be addressed after World War II, and now will have to be addressed, if we're dealing with a world where China is trying to grab and create those norms for itself. So there are different. I think there would be different structures that would be more politically acceptable. Vietnam could sign an Indo-Pacific Charter, but Taiwan could sign an Indo-Pacific Charter, but it would be much more difficult to incorporate it into a Quad.
Yeah. Dr. Madan, about ASEAN itself, now we're looking at it in terms of getting various countries individually, collectively on board in terms of a pushback against China. But China has been, for a long time, been very aware of the situation in ASEAN and playing ASEAN in terms of, finding the weakest link, which is not very difficult there, to keep them divided.
So I think there are two different elements here. I think the Quad itself is likely to have more luck working with individual Southeast Asian states who, as I said, are like-minded. And I meant like-minded about also willing to work with these countries, understanding that each of them not just has kind of their own equations with China, but some, don't want to actually lean one way or the other and try to play a middle road. And that's fair enough for them. They are smaller countries and will be vulnerable in ways that the larger countries aren't. And so I think the issue will be kind of, find like-mindeds to work with. And so you have, for example, in Australia, India, Indonesia, trilateral. You'll have kind of some of these exercises that take place with bringing in some of the Southeast Asian countries. You have a US, Australia, Japan, South Korea exercise that just happened, Pacific Vanguard. So I think that's going to be kind of the ask. I think China is going to continue to try to deter countries from working with the Quad. It has tried to also, it's moved between saying that both the Indo-Pacific idea is, I think Wang Yi called it, that it will be like sea foam. It will come and go. It will dissipate. And that, going from saying that it doesn't matter to saying it's going to be an Asian Quad, partly to scare the ASEANs off. That this is, which is why, I actually I don't think the Quad needs a headquarters. Because, I actually would rather see what they actually do institutionalize in action before a headquarters is set up, because then you just get into the process. After all, the SCO has a headquarters, but to me, it's less like-minded, say, than the Quad. I think it would also be seen by the ASEANs, as perhaps, especially if it's on the Senkakus, as perhaps unnecessarily provocative. After all, Taiwan also has issues with Japan on that. So I think, to me, the question is, look, the Quad it's about deterring bad behavior from China. It's about maintaining a rules-based order in the region, and it's about ensuring a favorable balance of power in the region so that China doesn't dominate. So each country is going to do what they think fit. And what I like about what the US Deputy Secretary of State, Steve Biegun, said recently is that each Quad country they'll set the pace collectively. It's not going to be one trying to move full speed ahead. And I think that is what will make it sustainable. So you've heard even former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Michel Flournoy, here, write in the Financial Times about the Quad being an effective thing and something to build upon. So I think even Democrats have embraced it at this point.
Ms. Paskal, if you want to take the discussion on the ASEAN and the weak link there, and I believe you have an interesting point to make about South Korea as well.
Yeah, so it all depends. The whole framework for how you feel about this depends on how far you think China's going to go. And China pushes out. China has this policy of comprehensive national power, which is embedded in the way that they examine their relationship with the world, and it's numerical. It's they give themselves it's within the think tank world. It's extremely influential in terms of mental framework. So you can gain points for military influence, political influence. This is sort of going out, access to natural resources. And once you kind of understand that mentality, you can see that the push out process is extremely aggressive across all fronts. And the front that we've seen most recently, deeply, deeply concerning, is the concerns raised that there was a rigging of the April elections in South Korea. Their votes they're hand ballots, but they're counted electronically. And the electronic counting machines have Huawei components within them. The election produced a surprising result. It produced a very large majority for the Moon government, almost within reach of being able to change the constitution. And there are a lot of there are investigations going on now externally looking at what happened in South Korea, because the South Koreans themselves are not doing any of the investigations they normally would do after a questioned election. Normally, it would take about 3 months to start going through some of the court cases. There have been over 130 court cases challenging the result. None of them have been investigated. And the servers are being taken. They're trying to take the servers away for maintenance. They're trying to get rid of all of the potential evidence. And that is consistent with what you would expect the Chinese Communist Party to do if it had a willing partner in the Moon government. And the end game is obviously push the Americans off the peninsula. So there's a lot of different things going on. And if you are that level of concern, where the democracies, the mechanisms of democracy are coming under a very sophisticated attack, then the way that you push back has to be much more comprehensive. You have to have a kind of comprehensive national defense or multinational defense to try to deal with this scale of attack. So, as an analyst, basically, depending on where you fall on the spectrum of how serious you think China is about grabbing and changing the world order for its own benefit, for the benefit of the Chinese Communist Party, that's how far you're going to be willing to push back. COVID gave a little opening, and what we saw coming out of India, especially with the banning of the apps, was kind of a moment of genius in terms of looking at all of the various ways you can start to push back.
The need to push back, Dr. Madan, I mean, more evident, especially for India post Galwan and what's been happening in Ladakh. But would you say the evolution of India's foreign policy vis-a-vis the Quad and why we didn't want to provoke, like you're saying, make the headquarters in Senkaku or the Andaman Islands, was one that we weren't sure whether we would be the last country standing within the Quad and whether the other countries would, according to how they were dealing with China, not really stand together. Was that one of them?
Well, it was quite complicated and there were a few different factors. I think one was a concern on the part of each one of the Quad countries that the other one was going to blink. And if you remember back to that period when Quad 1.0 was going on, every country had something going on with China that they needed Beijing for. And so, yes, the Australians, there was a change in government, and you saw them kind of, but they, even before the change in government, if you look at that summer, before they pulled out of the Quad, they had already started expressing concerns of how China would react. Even before the Rudd government took office, he, of course, very prominently withdrew. And I think what really irked people was his foreign minister saying it while he was at a press conference with his Chinese counterpart. I think that particularly riled people up, and therefore it was seen as just Australia and concerns about Australia's China policy. But at that time, India also needed China. India needed an NSG waiver from China at that time. The US needed Chinese support for Iran policy. And Japan also had a change in government. That's when Shinzo Abe left office as well. So I think there was a confluence of conditions at that time that made it untenable from kind of the Indian approach. I think there was also, India tends to do things step by step. So it doesn't surprise me that it started off working level. If you look at what happened with the US, India, Japan trilateral, it was a similar evolution. Started at the working level, then moved on to a trilateral kind of ministerial, as well as, and it took years for it to get to Japan officially being part of Malabar. And then kind of, you had a leader level meeting. So between that, there was 6 or 7 years from start to finish. So to me, the Quad is actually not just on pace, but has beaten the pace of that institutionalization. So it does not surprise me at all. And part of taking it step by step is it helps you suss out how serious and how sustainable the others' kind of approach is going to be. To me, what's different about this time is that one, it's lasted far longer. Second, if there's one factor that's driving them, these countries, and frankly speaking, they'll never admit it publicly, but it is Chinese behavior. So, if China hadn't given the Quad a big assist, I'm not sure it would have lasted this long or frankly even been revived.
Or be needed.
Ms. Paskal, again, I apologize for the lights going off here a couple of times, but I think, Ms. Paskal, you have a different view on how words should be used in terms of calling out China. And the point about India, again, taking it step by step, but you do believe, I think, that India should be leading the pack.
Yeah, so I think that, the Indian strategic community has had a really rough time of it. India has been attacked and at war, and had conflicts on its borders since birth, since the birth of modern India. So, and it hasn't, and those security concerns haven't been fully understood or appreciated or supported by who should have been like-minded partners at the time. So I understand why there's a real insecurity within the community, to say we should get closer to the U.S. or we should do this and that. And at the same time, you're dealing with a situation where there are a lot of vested interests to benefit from the current strategic construct that India is embedded in. So obviously China wants, India to be out of the game, so to speak, the greater game, but so does Russia. And that Russia has been there supporting India in certain ways for a long time. So is France. Those are countries that may not want to see a rapprochement between India and the U.S. and who have people who they've been working with for a very long time, at a personal level, at a financial level, who don't want to see any sort of big change. So, I understand there are a lot of legitimate intellectual reasons for reticence on the part of India, and there are a lot of embedded lobbies that have been there a long time with a lot of money and a lot of targeting that also don't want to see it. But what I've seen from the outside, especially since Galwan, is the leadership within the strategic community within India of actually understanding what will hurt China. Like that app ban was, I keep coming back to it because it was the first time for me where I realized this is really smart way of handling China, because it deprived them of metadata for weaponizing IA. It deprived them of potential espionage and blackmail material. It knocked $6 billion off of ByteDance. Like, it hit in such a complicated level of ways that it showed me that the real thought leadership on how to lead this fight is coming out of India. So, instead of India seeing itself as a junior partner to the US in this comprehensive multinational defense, I think actually it could be at least a thought leader in how to deal with some of these issues.
Dr. Madan, if you want to comment on that, and also wanted you to talk about the restructuring within the Ministry of External Affairs and what that also reflects at this time.
So I think, look, I think the Indian governments have had a more consistent view on China, and I've said this repeatedly, about China being a challenge since the mid to late 1950s. There has been a certain view. There's also been a general agreement on how to deal with it across party lines. And that's not just, I wouldn't say, sure, are there vested interests? Absolutely. I'm sure they are everywhere. But I don't think that's what explains Indian policy. I think what explains Indian policy is structural factors in India's own experience, which is that they have had partners who have not had the same view of the US. After all, India had a implicit security assurance from the US in the 60s, and they found in 1971, as everybody kind of repeats, that it wasn't so unreliable. What wasn't so reliable? They found that Russia or Soviet Union wasn't reliable in 62. So maybe I might actually disagree with kind of India, Russia, how, the kind of talking about it as a constantly a reliable partner, etc., and time tested, because I actually don't think it is. But I understand why, why thinking people might have made that judgment that it is not good to rely just on the US, because frankly, the US has also changed its mind at time, and India seeks to be able to have options in case the US changes its mind, or Japan changes its mind, or Australia or Russia has changed its mind, as we see with its closer relationship with China. So I don't think it's necessarily wrong to have a diversified set of partnership. But what I do think is sometimes choices need to be made that reflect Indian interests and not just kind of trying to keep everybody happy, because sometimes you're going to have to upset somebody. So I think that, I see this slightly differently, which is what, I understand why after all, India can't ditch a Russia relationship in the middle of a crisis when India is still highly dependent on Russia for spare parts and equipment. These things just don't happen overnight. But if you think people in government aren't noticing what Russia is doing with China and what it's supplying China, I think it's not giving officials enough credit on that front. I say this as somebody who tends to be skeptical of Russia's kind of role in this, but I would just say I don't want to say that it's happening only because of kind of lobbyists or this thing. I think there have been broader reasons, and they've happened it is interesting that both parties and across the spectrum you've seen consistent policy. I think structural factors matter, and this is where I'll go very quickly on the restructuring. I think the MEA restructuring. I think it reflects two things at least. One, that the Indo-Pacific is here to stay in Indian conceptualization. Second, that Australia seems to be getting more attention, but also I think it reflects the fact that the relationship has moved and matured to the point that it will be I think it was in a crowded division, in the southern division, which also had ASEAN. So now not just Australia and New Zealand, but also the Pacific Islands will be, and I think, and it is also being led by an additional secretary level person, Ambassador Reenat Sandhu, who also has some experience in the US, having served here for some length of time, that I think this will give it more attention. But I think it tells me that there is this idea of kind of syncing up, because it's also going to be connected to the other related divisions, that it does reflect kind of that integration, but also the sustainability of this concept. And very briefly, for those who are watching and don't know, what has happened is that there's now a new additional secretary position who will handle the Indo-Pacific, the Southern Division, which is essentially ASEAN plus East Timor, and a separate division for Oceania, which is these countries that I mentioned, other than Australia. They will continue to be separate Indian Ocean region divisions led by a joint secretary, and a Bangladesh-Myanmar division also led by a joint secretary.
Ms. Paskal, for the final words, what are your expectations of what will come out of Tokyo? And then, of course, post that, I think the Indo-US 2+2 is also scheduled.
Yeah, I mean, we're on a certain track. What will change the speed, direction, momentum will be China's actions. So if it can't hold back and it attacks something, everything speeds up and goes in a very specific direction. But if it manages some restraint, then it'll take away some of the momentum, because some of the economic push is still there. I mean, China still has all of its influence in a lot of locations, and so we'll see what happens in that direction. I personally think that for internal Chinese reasons, Chinese Communist Party reasons, something may happen probably after the U.S. election. And the question is, is it going to be East China Sea, South China Sea on the Himalayan border? And this is another thing that India's been smart at. It's made the Himalayas a hard target. India used to, in the mind of some CCP strategists, be the soft target. So we'll see where it goes now. It's very dynamic.
Dr. Madan, how do you see China reacting to all this?
Well, I think, what we're seeing to some extent is two views being coming out of China from Chinese analysts. That there's one set of views that says a kind of a more moderate view, which is, why this is not a good idea to get all your neighbors plus a few others upset with you at the same time. This is not great policy. And we've seen China do this before, overstretch and then correct. Self-correct to some extent, but this has happened now twice in the last decade or so. This is the third time it's happening, and so they're calling for that correction, which is to say that, okay, even if we consider the US our primary competitor, then the idea should be to kind of create wedges between the Quad countries and between these like-mindeds by moderating our stance towards them. And so in that framing, the idea would be to kind of tone things down, reach an agreement with India, etc. The second view is, of course, the opposite, which is, no, this is, you have to go full speed ahead. You can't back down. This is a sovereignty issue. And so, China should continue to show, and that any kind of stabilizing of this will be seen as weakness, and weakness vis-a-vis all these countries, and it will be seen as a US victory. So we need to actually press countries like India, which will send a signal to the Southeast Asians, but it will also send a signal to countries like the US that basically India is not up to the task. I think the one thing I would say about these, and I agree with Cleo, that I think the pace is often kind of, and Chinese behavior will shape where this goes. But I do think it's important that whatever Chinese behavior is, that the Quad countries should not just link their development to it, because then China is in control of this situation. So I think whether it's in dealing with the ASEAN countries, whether in dealing with each other, they should steadily continue to whether even if it's quietly, continue to deepen this cooperation and broaden this cooperation, and not just leave it at China's mercy for when it's feeling pleased with people and when it's unhappy. But I think very much a subject of debate. And as a non-democracy, we don't know there is not that level of transparency in China where we know who's winning out. But at the moment, Xi Jinping's seems to be favoring the more kind of the more hawkish school. We'll see if that changes. And I think one thing to watch is how China reacts after the US election.
Dr. Tanvi Madan, it was an absolute pleasure having you on StratNews. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me on the show.
And Ms. Paskal, again, it was an absolute pleasure. Hope to have you again for that discussion on maple syrup and the Stanley Cup. Thanks for your time as well.
So what team? What team are you supporting? You have to say.
Well, I haven't been. like I said, I have been following Stanley Cup for years now. The last I remember was Wayne Gretzky and the Edmonton Oilers, I think.
You win. You got it. that's the only thing you have to know. That's the only important thing that came out of this discussion.
Okay, so that will be the headline then. Thank you so much, Ms. Paskal and Dr. Madan again. Absolute pleasure. And do log on to our website for the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective. And if you like our kind of journalism, to support us on our website. You've been watching Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi.